right, so a little bit about me and about Merkle. I have been an analytics consultant for a long time. I work at Merkle. We're a big agency. Our analytics, we're primarily a CRM agency with a very strong analytics team. So we have, within the analytics group, about 300 statisticians, which means that they have to have a minimum of a master's degree in a quantitative study in order to be part of our team. We manage a lot of customer databases, which was one of the things that I was really excited about, coming from more traditional web analytics, not having access to that customer data, and that has been really fun. I also wrote a book recently called It Only Looks Like Magic. It is not about dashboards. It is about real-time optimization with big data. Not why you should do it, but the actual how. How you actually track email and social and site, and how we connect all that data together in order to create those customer profiles. All right, so what we're going to cover today. 5 things you need to know about dashboards. Then I'm going to give you my 10 best tips for dashboards and visualizations. And then I'm going to share 5 dashboard examples, tell you why I like them, and then I also have some bonus material. So I speak at a lot of conferences, and I have a lot of great material, and it is not going to fit in this 45-minute slot. So what I decided to do anyway was to keep the material, keep it in the deck, so you'll still have all of that you can access. I just won't be covering it during the presentation. Okay, so let's start with the 5 things you need to know about dashboards. This is important because we want to make sure we're all on the same page, a little level setting about dashboards. First thing, it is not a dashboard unless it actually has some visual element. Every single day, somebody shows me a 32-tab Excel file and says, "What do you think of my dashboard?" I was just looking at one. I was out on a client site before I came in this morning, and I was just looking at their dashboard, and it was pivot table. Pivot table is not a dashboard. It was a fantastic pivot table, but it was not a dashboard, right? Unless there's some visual element to it, it's not a dashboard. It also needs to be focused on your key performance indicators. So the reason why you have a dashboard is that it tells you how you're performing against your goals. If you don't have goals, you don't need a dashboard. And it's not a good dashboard unless there are context for those KPIs, which we're going to talk a little bit about. It also needs to fit on one screen. So I think this is really important. So it's not to say you can't have multiple dashboards. In fact, you often do. But there's been a lot of research about our ability to process information, and when we can see it all at the same time, it allows us to make those connections better. So literally, whenever I design a dashboard, I have a very limited piece of real estate that I'm working with. And like I said, I might end up with multiple views of it, but it's important that it fits all on one screen or page. Substance and style are equally important. If you don't have good data, good insights, you're not going to have a good dashboard. That said, if your dashboard is ugly, it's not a good dashboard, no matter how fantastic your KPIs are. When we go through my presentation, I'm going to give you a lot of examples, and you're going to discover that I am obscenely picky. And I got a little bit of OCD going, and I'm really, really picky about dashboards. That said, an automated dashboard is better than a perfect one. I don't want to spend every day, like every minute of my day, just like you guys, making that dashboard exactly perfect, because I'd rather have it automated so I can spend my time on the insights. That said, I am still really picky, and I push really hard to make sure that my automated dashboards are fantastic, but that is definitely an area where I'm going to be flexible. And then the last thing is, executive dashboards are highly visible. Like, if you can do a great dashboard, it is going to be great for your career. I used to do a workshop around the country called Pimp Your Reports, and there are are a lot of people who came out of my class that got promoted, where it said, you know, I love that dashboard that you showed me. I took it home, put our logo on it, and guess what? It got shown at our company QBR, right? So having a really great dashboard, your ability to do that can really help you be successful as an analyst. All right, so I want to talk about my 10 tips for dashboard design. We're going to break them into substance, layout, and then visualizations. So the first thing, this is the absolute first thing about your dashboard. We need to make sure that we understand which metrics you're working with, and we're going to put them in buckets. I put them in your actual KPIs, which means it's a business driver or a business outcome, and it tells you how you're doing. Are you doing well? Good, bad? How are you doing? It's not very actionable because that's the next level down. The next level down are those diagnostic metrics. And the diagnostics metrics will help you figure out, okay, if I want to move the dial on my KPI, what is going to make the most difference there? I am usually very careful when I talk about KPIs. I make a distinction between a key metric, an important metric, and an actual KPI. It's not a KPI unless it meets 3 criteria. The first one is it needs to measure performance against an objective. If you don't have an objective, it's not a KPI. That said, I do a lot of dashboards where I'm doing what I would call retroactive strategy. So I'm having to put together KPIs, and then I'm informing the client what I thought the objective was. And they can say, yeah, that makes sense. Good, this is a great KPI. But I'm always making that connection, even if the client hasn't made that connection yet. It's not a KPI unless somebody is accountable for it. So if that number goes way down and nobody gets in trouble, it is not important enough to be on your dashboard. One of the ways that I narrow down the KPIs that are on my dashboard, I get everybody in a room, and if nobody will own it and be accountable for whether it goes up or down, it doesn't get on my dashboard. It also doesn't get in any of my business requirements. So I'm like, you guys all think this is important? Okay, this is fantastic. But when we prioritize, we're going to prioritize only based on the ones that people are going to be accountable for. And then there needs to be context for whether that number is good or bad, and I'm going to give you some good examples for that. One of the types of metrics that you really need to be aware of is one that I call a smoke alarm. So a smoke alarm is a number that you have to have your arms around. You have to report on it. People need to see it. That said, it's kind of complex. It goes up or down. People really don't know. It's not very actionable. For a lot of companies, visits are one of those things. There's so many things that drive visits to your site. I mean, you have to report it, but at the same time, if it goes up or down, nobody really freaks out unless it goes way up or down, and then everybody's running and doing the analysis and trying to understand, why things dropped off. This is really important before you start your dashboard, because we're going to talk about the location of where you put everything on your dashboard, and which type of metric it is going to determine the location. All right, so the second thing is we need to select the most meaningful metric. When a client, let's say a client has done they've had fantastic work, they know exactly what their KPIs are, they're fantastic KPIs, I think they're great too, right? But then we're going to put the dashboard together. Sometimes those KPIs don't translate exactly, that there's a little bit of a variation on it that you need in order for it to be meaningful on an ongoing basis. And I'll show you what I mean. So I would create a new metric when I'm trying to highlight the relationship between two metrics. An example would be visits per visitor. I never report both visits and visitors. This one's totally basic, but I never report both visits and visitors on a dashboard. That doesn't make any sense. right? I might do visits, and then I might do visits per visitor, but I'm not going to force people to do that math in their head and try to understand what that relationship is. It's also important to provide context. A good example is people who report revenue, and when visits go up, revenue goes up. You have two graphs, but you want people to understand the relationship between those two. You might create a new metric, and I'm going to show you that example too. And then also normalizing the data. I saw a dashboard last week. This is horrible. You guys are going to appreciate this. So I saw this dashboard last week that was had January and February, and it was leads. Right? So they had the January new leads, then the February leads, and the February leads were extrapolated based on 31 days so that they compare it to January. It's like, no, that's not how we normalize data, right? The raw number of leads, it did go down in February. It did. It didn't go up. This is a made-up number. That said, you're right. We do want to provide context, but let's use a leads per day as a context instead. Okay, so here's an example. Very common. We've got visits, we've got revenue. You would look at this and you would say, oh man, Q4 sucked. Our revenue our visits were a horrible tank. Revenue, a steady decline. This is pretty horrible. No. If you look at a new metric and you look at revenue per visit, this is actually fantastic. Q4 had twice the performance of the other quarters. And when I saw this is actually real data. When I saw this, what I actually knew was that these guys had actually cut off the untargeted marketing that they were doing. So their visits dropped way down, but the people who were coming to their site were a lot more qualified, so their conversions went up. All right, so I said your dashboards need to have context. The way they have context is that you make a comparison with the number. 6 ways you make in comparisons. First one, you compare it to a target. Trend, how does it change over time? A rank, a hierarchy, a correlation, a composition. Composition is like what you would use a pie chart for. What portion of the whole does it account for? And then the distribution, so how does it fall across the range? An example of that, again, totally basic metrics, but I found that sometimes when I use these, it makes it easier for everybody in the audience to understand. A good one might be page views per visit. That is a horrible KPI to try to optimize against. One, it's one of those KPIs where low is bad and high is bad. And there's some magic in the middle there. And without some statistical analysis, you don't necessarily know what that is. But in any case, it's difficult to optimize against. But instead, if we look at the distribution and we see who are the people who are only looking at one page, who are the people that are looking at 2 to 3, who are people that are looking at more than 4, and now I can optimize against that. I can have a strategy for the people who are bouncing on my landing page. I can have a strategy for the people who are getting 1 page into my product pages, and figure out how I can get them 1 more, and now I have something that's actionable. All right. Whenever we do dashboards, I think it's really important that the dashboards have context. Context. I make sure, because I don't want anybody to think that I do reporting. I definitely do reporting. I provide insights. And the reports are one of the tools that I use to communicate to you what my insights are. So when you're adding your commentary on your dashboards, it needs to be insightful and not narration. Narration is revenue went up by 3.6%, conversion rate went down by 2.8%. That's narration. That's like a voiceover of your graphs, right? So instead, you can say, did you notice any trends? Are there any anomalies? Was there anything happen that you expected to happen? to say, you know, actually revenue from search was pretty steady. Okay, but the problem is we doubled our paid search spend. We thought this number would look better. Implications and then recommendations as well. Okay, location, location, location. This is an example of a sample dashboard. I do not have a single dashboard that looks exactly like this, but it's good to help think about where things would go. Your most important metrics are going to go at the very top. And then your least important metrics are going to go in that bottom right. So this is the place that nobody ever gets to. So if I'm working for you, and you have your favorite KPI, and I design your dashboard, and I stick your KPI over here, you'll know what I thought of your KPI. That's the spot on the dashboard where I put the stuff that I'm forced to put. And when they force me to put a pie chart on there, because it's not the dashboard list has pie chart, when they want to see the top 10 pages, which never changes, right, I stick it over in that corner. The thing that's really important to know here, though, is that your absolute, go back one more. Your absolute most important metric is right here, is this upper left-hand corner. Don't stick your logo there. Nobody is going to forget what company they're working for while they're looking at the dashboard. Right? Stick it over here, peripheral vision, but your most important KPI goes right there. It is definitely not your smoke alarm metrics. Your smoke alarm metrics we're going to stick over here in the bottom right. Okay, we also want to group related things together. It doesn't matter how you do it. Depending on the dashboard, I do it different ways. One might be, you know, these are traffic related and these ones are conversion related. Or I might have them going, you know, the other direction. We also want to make sure that everything aligns to a grid. Everything in my dashboard always lines up. There are a ton of tips that I can share with you about how you would actually do that without spending all of your time, you know, tweaking things to be able to do that. All right, we also use size to show relative importance. The things that are the most important on your dashboard should be bigger than everything else. And if you don't know what's important on your dashboard, you already have a problem. And that's why we go back to what were the KPIs versus the diagnostic metrics. And font size, don't let Excel determine what the font size is going to be. You guys control that. You look at where everything is at, and then you make sure that the most important things are bigger. One of the things I use a lot as a tool on my dashboard is what I call a KPI block. Feel free to use this on any of your dashboards if it's helpful. So my number for that current period, let's say it's last month, is going to be bigger than everything else. When you scan it, I want you to see that. I'm also going to add a piece about context because I want to remind them, like the reason why you care about this is that this is related to your loyalty objective. Right? So otherwise you have KPIs that are kind of floating nowhere, and then nobody remembers those conversations about why those things were important. And then I have, you know, the trend, which is providing that context, and then the comparison to the previous periods. That's not important. I mean, it's good context, but it can be smaller. It doesn't need to be the same size. All right, you also need to select the right visualization for the job. There are two questions you need to ask yourself before you select your visualization. The first one is this time series data, or is it a point in time? There are a lot of visualizations out there. The only ones I'm going to talk about right now are the ones that should go on executive dashboards. They're totally different. So the ones that I might use as an analyst to help me, you know, gain insight from the data are completely different than once I actually know what the insight is, I can simplify that and then communicate that out to the executives. So for a time series, we're going to talk about the difference between a column graph and a line graph. They are not interchangeable. And you don't get to pick which one you like depending on which one you like, right? It's going to be on what your intention was. You would use a column graph because you want to be able to compare 2 periods. So if I wanted to be able to compare August to September, then I'm going to use a column graph. If really what I'm focusing on is how the number changes over time, that's a line graph. That make sense? Okay. And then the last one is a stacked area. So stacked column charts. A few things you need to know about them. One is that most of them are horrible. Okay? You really should not have more than 4 or 5 columns or series because you can't actually see how they change beyond that. So let's say your data has more series. Whatever, roll it up. So you've got, I have this client has 10 products, and they're insisting on this stacked column chart. Okay, well, that's fantastic, but we're still only going to do, we've got the 3 main products, and then the rest of them are other. And then there's a table, just click on that, the next tab, you can actually have all the detail about those products. But you need to keep that short. One of the reasons why I'm recommending a stacked area rather than a stacked column is that if you want to see the trend, it's a lot easier when they're closer together, and you can kind of see how it moves. Still, if you have a lot of them, there's usually some other way that you want to be able to tell that story. If you have a point in time, we're going to talk about the difference between a bar graph and a pie graph. Again, this is really important. If you want to compare, you're going to use a bar graph. Right? And also, I'm saying column graph, bar graph. Doesn't mean that you have to accept that language, but I'm making a distinction because they're 2 very different types of visualizations. So if you want people to be able to compare, you need to use a bar graph and not a pie graph. There has also been a lot of research about our ability to compare, and we are wired to compare distance and not area. It is very difficult to actually compare 2 pieces of the pie, but instead if you make those bars, and in fact, it's not just distance, it's actual horizontal distance. So people can make better comparisons between a bar graph than a column graph. So I am very specific. Is it time series? Then it is a column graph. If it's not, then it's going to be a bar graph. The only time I use a pie graph is when I'm trying to make a point, and I'm trying to usually be obnoxious. Like, this much of your revenue comes from social, right? There are times when you want to use it. There's important where you really want them to see like the proportion out of 100% composition. But for a lot of times, if you actually think about what it was that you were trying to communicate, a pie graph is not the right visualization. Like I said, I speak all over the country, and if I ever get the room worked up, this is the one where I say, don't use a pie graph. And then all the questions are, well, I had this situation, like, I wanted to be able to compare like these 2 things, and I'm sure that it's a pie graph. I'm like, no, it's not. And then somebody else says, well, I had this different situation, like on my dashboard, I'm trying to do this. No, it's not a pie graph. So, for those of you who are writing down your question about whether your situation accounts for a pie graph, no, it doesn't. If you want more advice on that, you have to buy me a beverage, and then I'll give you a little bit of better advice on that. But pretty much, no. I do have dashboards, though, that have pie graphs on them, because I call it pick your battles. Because there are times when there's an executive that will not accept the dashboard unless there's a pie graph on it. But I fight it pretty hard until we actually get there. For those of you fighting that battle, Stephen Few actually wrote a 30-page white paper about the research behind why pie graphs are terrible. And it's called Save Pie for the Dessert. And if you find yourself fighting that battle, I would be happy to share that with you. And then the last one is a scatter graph. It's definitely less common, but it's really the only way that you can show correlations. Okay, eliminate distractions and extra detail. So, common distractions. I'm going to go through some examples, so we're just going to go through this list fast. Colored backgrounds, garish colors, like, you think you're trying to make them bright. No. We're going to go with that neutral color tone so that when we use those stoplight colors, the red, yellow, green, that they'll really pop. Third dimension, things should not be third dimensional unless you actually have a third dimension that you're graphing. Excessive axis values, 10 billion, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, that's unnecessary. Zeros, decimal places, gap width. I will show you this example in a minute. Grid lines, there are exceptions to that one. And then extra stuff. Don't have a decimal point unless the difference is actually statistically significant. Don't be afraid to use an other category. And then we talked about stack columns. And then don't use a large graph when a spark line or a spark bar will do. Okay, a few things about color. Things that are the same should be the same color, even if you're on different screens. So if I'm comparing 2013 to 2014, let's say one is a column graph and one is a line graph, 2013 should be exactly the same color in both of those visualizations. That allows people, when they're scanning, to be able to pick it up faster. Okay, a really important thing. If this is the only thing that you remember, aside from you probably need a bar graph and not a pie graph, this is the only other thing that you remember. We do not use color on our dashboards to make them pretty. You use color because color adds meaning. So every time I put something in color on my dashboard, whether I do it on purpose or not, like you never use red or green unless you're trying to tell people that things are good or bad. All right, and we want to be deliberate about the axis values. Again, don't let Excel tell you what the maximum is going to be. One of the things that will happen sometimes is, let's say you have your graph, you're doing your monthly report, everything's looking pretty slick, and then you finally meet your target. And then what happens is the axis changes. And so you'll get a call, oh my God, what happened? Our revenue went down. No, our revenue didn't go down. It was you're used to seeing the number up here, the bar up here, and then it dropped down because that changed. So the way that I do this, to try to keep myself honest, is I always set my minimum at 0, and then I have a rule where I look at whatever I think the best performance really is going to be, and I'm going to look out a few months because I don't want to change this every month. And then I usually add 25% to that, and that's what I set as the maximum. And that works pretty well for me. Sometimes we outperform, and that's good too, but it's a good rule. All right, and you want to make sure that people can actually read your dashboard. This is actually the second thing. I give a lot of feedback on dashboards. This is the second thing that I normally talk about, where the fonts are so small that I can't read them. Typically never go smaller than 8 points. Don't rotate things at an angle. That makes it hard to read too. And then one trick. So here's a good example. So one of the things you can do to make it more easily read is to actually increase your row height. So if you look at my example there, I'll look my example over here because my mic's on that side. if you look at your example over there, the font size is actually smaller in the second one, but it's more easily read because there's better white space around that. That's a really, that's one of those tips that I use all the time that really will make a big difference. Okay, example number 1, and this is also a real life example. Like I said, I'm really picky about dashboards. There is this rule on my team that you can't actually, no matter who you are, how high you are up in my organization, you can't send out your own dashboards until you can get a dashboard by me where I can't find anything that I would change. They call it hazing, I call it education. This was an example of one of them. So I got this, and my question was, all right, what were they trying to do with this visualization? Because if what they were trying to do was compare completion rates by product category, this is the wrong visualization. So if we were going to compare, that's when we have our bar graph. So a bar graph would have been a lot more effective. Except whenever you have a bar graph, you also want to make sure that you're sorting them with the highest value going down, and then we would duplicate it for each step. That makes this is much, much easier for you to be able to compare performance by product category. But wait a minute, I didn't actually want to, this is actually the truth. But thank you, Jennifer, but I didn't actually want to compare that. What I wanted to do was compare overall performance. Okay, well, you picked the wrong KPI. This is, if you want to compare overall performance, use a measure of overall performance. This is better. It makes it a lot easier anyway. Okay, second example. We're going to go back to the same visualization, except this time we're going to pretend it's time series. You know, it's quarters. There's still a lot here that we want to fix, but first of all, we're going to clean it up. So these are some examples of when I said, you know, these are some of the things you need to do. Here's a good example of what that looks like. So there we go. Okay, so you see here that the decimal point, which didn't make any difference, I've removed that. You can see that I've used that neutral color palette that's doing the variation by saturation instead of completely different colors. I've also removed the decimal point here because the reality is it isn't significant, and it makes it much, much easier to read. But it's still not helping you compare product categories. So in that case, if you want to do the comparisons, it was a completely different visualization that you need. So we would do, you know, completion rate for each one. All right, here are some dashboard examples. Before we do that though, just a little more context around the BI analytics continuum. So on one hand, we have reporting, and on the other hand, we have insight, and there's a lot in the middle. And you're going to need both of those things, like that entire continuum. Sometimes people will hire me because they want me to design a dashboard, and they think that's going to fix their problem. The dashboard never fixes your problem. The dashboard sits on top of a robust analytics program, right? So if you can't trust the underlying data, that dashboard isn't going to fix that problem. So there's always a piece where we're looking at, you know, what are the objectives, what are the KPIs, what are the diagnostic metrics, how are we going to want to look at those, what actually goes in the dashboard versus what is a diagnostic report that we just want to be available to us. An example, we would have, within any program, you're going to have multiple views for certain people. If you're doing a good job with your dashboards, you're only updating the data once, so it doesn't cost you time to have multiple views, but it sure increases the usability of your reports. Okay. The other thing about dashboards, There are no perfect dashboards that are in production. There are a lot of dashboard contests. I think you should actually have to prove that somebody's using your dashboard in order to win that contest. And because it has to be real, I think you should also be able to just put in writing anything that was not best practice. If you just put in writing why you did it, and just note that you knew it wasn't best practice, I think that should be good enough. So, I'm going to show you a bunch of real dashboards. They're not perfect, because they're real. This one, where we have objectives with the KPIs below those, this is one of those ones where I could not convince them in fewer KPIs. But you have, it's very clear, easy to scan, but the insights for these guys are actually communicated in an email, because that